Thanks everyone. Fantastic webinar ahead. As I said, we'll be looking at the budget and the CreditorWatch business risk review. I'm super excited about this. I've got the amazing Ali Kane who will be moderating, but I've also asked her to make sure she gets very much involved in today's webinar. Ali, great to have you with us.
Thanks very much for having me, Pat. You know this is my favourite day of the year.
That's right. And of course, CreditorWatch Chief Economist Harley Dale, who is live from Canberra, the heartbeat of it all, has been churning through the data and the hundreds of articles that have been published. He's been getting phone calls left, right and centre about what does it all mean, and we're fortunate enough to have his expert opinion with us today as well. Thanks for joining us, Harley.
Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity, Patrick, and good morning to all. Ahead of, I'm sure, is going to be a really insightful webinar that provides everybody with a little bit of information about the budget and the business risk review results for April from CreditorWatch. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. As always, really quickly, who is CreditorWatch? What do we do? And why are we allowed to make, statements about the budget and the business risk review and the economy? This is our product suite, credit reporting solutions, from onboarding a customer seamlessly online through to assessing the risk that those customers represent to you at the beginning and end and middle of a relationship, and of course plenty of analysis and automation tools as well. We're not here to talk too much about that. Key highlights, really important. We're getting amazing data and insights from over 50,000 customers, companies across Australia, from sole traders all the way up to large banks. So we've got a really diverse mix of information coming through, gives you a sort of 360-degree view of how payments are being made, which segments are in trouble, which segments are doing really well, and that can be industry or geographic. So lots to churn through, and obviously we talk about the business risk review a little bit later, probably in the second half of this, depending on how excited we get about the budget and how much we get into dissecting what took place last night. Before we get started, as always, we know the reason for today's webinar. Where can I ask questions? In the GoToWebinar control panel, there's a question and answer section. By all means, please do ask questions along the way. We will usually look at them at the end. I might sneak a peek midway through as we get talking about the budget side of things, in case we can answer that then and there. If not, we have got some time at the end of the webinar to go through the Q&A part. And of course, as always, we are recording today's webinar. We will send that out with the slides so that everyone can digest it as well at a later date if necessary, and of course share it with their colleagues. So what is the business risk review? Really quickly, business risk review is a monthly analysis of all the data that we get into CreditorWatch, and we're able to push out what we'll see later on in terms of insights and trends. What's happening with court actions, what's happening obviously with insolvencies administrations, the #1 most spoken about thing through COVID in terms of credit risk and threat to businesses, and of course looking at unique CreditorWatch data such as payment defaults being registered by our customers, and also of course trade payment, transactional payment data. How are companies paying their bills? Are certain segments doing better than others? So we will certainly get into that, but first and foremost I'm going to pass over to Ali and we are going to get into the federal budget side of things. Over to you, Ali.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Well, last night was a seminal budget. The COVID budget will go down in history as one of the most important of our time. A deficit of 161 billion is incredibly small in the grand scheme of things, especially when you look at budgets around the world, and there's huge amounts of spending for all sorts of areas: infrastructure, industry, for childcare, for aged care. But what does it all mean? We've seen the end of JobKeeper, but we really won't know what the effect of that will be until much later in the year. So I'm going to talk to Patrick and also Harley about what they think the budget means now and into the future, especially when it comes to things like payments. So Harley, I'm going to throw to you first. What's your biggest takeout from last night, aside from the headline numbers?
I think the biggest takeout, Ali, is that the government has acted appropriately, and I think a government of any colour would have done the same thing. Where, 2020 was an extraordinary year, and we needed an expansionary budget for the 2021-2022 year, and that was what was brought down last year. I know there are some commentators out there concerned about the lack of focus on, the level of debt and deficit we have. And yes, we do have a lot of debt and deficit, but I think appropriately, first and foremost, we need to look after our people, look after our economy, spend to grow, and I think that's basically what the budget has tried to do.
So, Patrick, last night, one of the, I guess, surprises was the announcement of a tax adjudicator that will sit between the ATO and small businesses. What is that going to mean for court actions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and I think we're going to obviously get a little bit more information about this over time. We know that the ATO has said in the last couple of weeks, if not it was last month, that they will commence collections again, which have pretty much been on hold for 12 months. We know that the ATO is the biggest creditor out there. We know that court actions are still at record lows. We're still sort of 40, 50, 60% down, depending on which state you look at, compared to pre-COVID numbers. So I think ultimately there's a few things that need to be considered here. One, the government needs to collect all of that money in order to meet the promises that have been delivered yesterday in the federal budget. Two, businesses have to pay it. You are a debtor to the government. You have to pay that money. I think there'll be a gentle approach to it. But I think with the adjudicator, if we can remove that red tape, if we can remove the costs that go into wind-ups and whatnot, I think that's a really important measure. And then the other thing to consider is the ATO will start to lodge tax defaults, which ultimately they're using as a collection tool rather than being draconian about everything. That they don't anticipate actually having to lodge a lot of them. I think the threat alone will get plenty of businesses paying bills, or at least getting into a payment plan of sorts.
I think, the ATO's actions will be extremely telling, because my understanding is that they've been pretty lenient through COVID and haven't, gone after small businesses in general. Do you think there's appetite for that to change? I think I've seen an announcement from the tax office to that effect, that, things are going to get a bit more serious from here.
Yeah, look, you could argue that the tax office is the biggest funder in Australia, the biggest bank. Ultimately, you don't necessarily pay any interest, and there's billions and billions of dollars outstanding to them. I think they'll have a real measured and pragmatic approach to collections. I think ultimately what we have to do, and it's very much linked to those zombie businesses that we spoke about a lot through COVID. This will allow them to force the hand of those companies that are basically burying their head in the sand. They're either burying their head in the sand or hiding for a couple of reasons. One, because they're taking advantage of COVID and not paying their bills, even if they can afford to. So hopefully that sort of weeds those type of businesses and directors out. And then probably at the other end of the spectrum, there's a bit in between, but the other end of the spectrum is ultimately there are companies out there that won't survive. They wouldn't have survived, if the insolvency changes hadn't have come in, if JobKeeper wasn't there. Businesses unfortunately need to be allowed to fail. That's the nature of a capitalist economy. and this will sort of force that to happen as well. It's important that we don't continue to support failed businesses, and ultimately that's what they are at this stage, as harsh as that sounds, because they do put more pressure on government resources. They suck government resources away from businesses who've actually got a future, but they also put pressure on the supply chain as well, because they're often racking up debt with other companies that can turn other creditors that don't have the sort of strength the ATO has, and we don't want to see good businesses go down as a result of bad businesses.
Harley, if I could ask this question to you. So we learnt last night that the government's going to extend the provision that allows businesses to immediately claim tax deductions. Is that going to be enough to drive business growth?
It's certainly a very welcome announcement that extension has been made, and I think Patrick's point about the provisions that have been made to make compliance costs a little bit less between potential business successes or failures with the ATO can proceed. That's a good thing as well. I would say though that the economic projections in the budget, which have the economy growing at 1.25% this year, 4.25% or thereabouts next year, and somewhere in between the year after, they're very heavily based on this consumer-led recovery, because consumers are cashed up, but businesses are going to have to invest. They've got to get back on track. They've got to employ. They've got to have confidence to put money into plant and equipment. And if there's one thing missing from last night's budget, I think that the business initiatives are welcome, but perhaps we needed to have just a little bit more focus on how we're going to rejuvenate a business community that got absolutely hammered by COVID, and I'm not convinced we saw that last night.
So you don't think that 1.2 billion for the digital economy and an extra 15 million for infrastructure is going to have that effect in terms of driving productivity?
Well, the infrastructure investment is very necessary and more than welcome, and it comes on top of 100 or 110 billion dollars that had already been committed to infrastructure investment pre the budget, but that additional expenditure occurs over a 10-year period with all the due process that has to go on in between, and so its impact on productivity growth will be measured over an extended period of time. Yes, there are other initiatives that I think are very welcome. I think the 2030 digital economy program is a great initiative, and it harnesses the comparative advantage that Australia has through the CSIRO and other organisations to be very, very good and very savvy at producing outcomes. But if you're going to the point of the line of businesses that are just trying to get on with it over the next 12, 18 months, that to them that doesn't really have much to do with infrastructure or looking at technological growth that enhances productivity. It's about the here and now of, how can we get on with it and not only survive but grow? And while we've got some things in the budget about that, I'm not convinced we've had enough.
So, Patrick, if I can extend that question to you and ask you, we've seen all this huge range of spending measures announced. When is that actually going to flow through to businesses' bottom lines?
Yeah, I think the point that Harley's making is an important one. It's a good one as well. You know, the biggest danger to the economy and to businesses at the moment is probably that next 6 to 12 months is they've just come off JobKeeper. They don't have necessarily the insolvency protections that really existed. There are some small business ones that are in there, of course. How do we get the money flowing quickly from the budget? How do we get consumers to open up their wallets? You know, everyone knows, and there's been plenty of talk about the fact that, you know, consumers especially are all cashed up, but they're not necessarily spending it. How do we get that out as soon as possible, right? Because if we don't, if it takes 12 months for these, you know, for the funds to sort of flow, you know, through the supply chain, regardless of the size of a, you know, an infrastructure project, we need to get that money flowing through the economy as quickly as possible to ensure that those businesses that are teetering on the edge or need that little bit of additional support make it through to start to feel that increase in the spend. I think the banks are still doing a fantastic job of supporting businesses and the economy, which is probably the most important thing. But I think if you take a step back and you look at the overall reaction to the budget, the numbers that are being spent, the money that's being saved, you know, where we could have been, the great employment results as well, I think the confidence is at an all-time high and much higher than anyone expected. And I think that naturally leads to business owners, directors having more confidence to employ more people, to give pay rises, to invest in, you know, technology and infrastructure themselves, to expand their businesses. And then, of course, from a consumer perspective, the consumer confidence will be up. We know, we see it in our own results. Bit of a dip in April, which we'll get to, but we see, you know, great stories like retail, hospitality, etc., where money is starting to flow back through because people have been cooped up and they want to spend it. They've also cashed up and they want to spend it. So, you know, from that sort of 30,000 foot level, confidence is the real key. 2020 was the year of negativity. For me, 2021 is the year of positivity, and we want to maintain that. But I think, you know, Harley makes a very, very good economic point around how do we get that money flowing as soon as possible, because, you know, the next sort of 6 to 12 months where people coming off the JobKeeper drip certainly need access to it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And, you know, it's really easy to put the boot into the government because, you know, it's fun and that's why we're here. But you're right. The government did an extraordinary job getting us through COVID. But some of these initiatives do feel a little bit like window dressing. I was talking to one small business owner this morning. There's going to be a special small business support coach, I guess. There's money in the budget for that to help small businesses digitize. And her point was, well, you know, I've done these courses in the past and they're not sophisticated enough to really help small businesses. So my question to you, Patrick, is does the government really have the skills to be able to support small businesses to digitize and get to that next level?
Look, the answer is probably no, but, you know, there's 1 million to 1.5 million businesses out there, maybe 2, depending on which way you measure a small business. You know, there's certainly businesses there that need that help, and that basic sort of coaching will help us a segment of it. You know, I think anyone that sort of follows the government, regardless of which party's in charge, regardless, to be honest, which country you're in, there's always cynicism there, and things like that will you know, will spike your interest and your sort of cynicalness inside of you. And I think that is certainly one of them. They've got to be able to say, oh, look, we're helping small business. Do those, you know, small business coaches make a huge difference? It's very hard. I would say it's impossible to measure. But, you know, I think talking to small business owners, small business owners don't have time to often collect debts that they're owed, let alone go and speak to a business coach about embracing technological change. So that probably answers my question, but I'd sort of like to throw your question back at you and get you involved in the discussion as well, and see what you sort of think about that, but in general what it means for business as well.
Well, I think there's more of a role for the private sector to help small businesses rather than these, small business hubs that often employ generalists that don't have that knowledge. I think there is a way to crowdsource that expertise to help small businesses digitize, because things really are changing fast. Social media, being able to use digital tools, things like e-invoicing, which was mentioned in the budget last night, they're hugely important for small businesses to be able to get that cash flow coming into their business. So I think there is more of a role for the private sector to help each other, maybe with a bit of government funding too. But I'm conscious of the time, and that we need to perhaps move on to the business risk review for this month, which is the first month that we've provided these numbers post the end of the JobKeeper stimulus package. So I'll hand over to you, Patrick, now to run through the numbers for this very important piece of research.
Fantastic, thanks, Ali. I'm sure we'll have some questions about the budget that we can come back to as well. So the first one I want to have a look at here is credit inquiries. So credit inquiries are a great way of getting, a feel for generally more so trade credit, but there's certainly, financial credit inquiries taking place here. And a credit inquiry, just to sort of, recap, is generally a creditor running a credit report. This is through CreditorWatch on a debtor that's either an existing customer or an applicant who's saying, hey, I want a credit account or a trade credit account, or I want finance for 5, 10, 50, whatever, however big the value is there. It's a really good way to see trade that's taking place, B2B transactions happening. You can see the sort of ups and downs. There's natural seasonality in here, of course, through December, Jan. There's always drops, less happens there. Sprung out of the blocks in Feb. March was huge. March is generally my favorite month because it's the first month in sort of 2 or 3 that Aussies really get back to work. No offense to anyone out there, but I've always said, from Melbourne Cup through to Australia Day, people are quite slow in Australia, and they live the Aussie way of life, which is great. Feb's a short month, and then you get March, and then unfortunately April comes along. We can see a big drop there, but that's quite typical of what you see because of things like Easter, Anzac Day, and school holidays. If you compare it to 12 months ago, it's significantly up. It's almost 30%. It might be more than 30% up there. Just doing some quick maths. So it's a really positive sign that we can see an upward trend from Feb onwards, and April is no different there. So that's a great one to see. The really important ones to look at, obviously, payment times in industries, and we always look at the best performing, the worst performing, and then I'll show you all of them across the board. So we're looking here what has happened from essentially March in the grey to April. Best performing industries, we're seeing education and training, which is good, while retail has retail is even better. It's gone from paying 20 days overdue to 15 days, which is great. Public administration and safety has seen a bit of an increase, but it's still, if you can be under that sort of 30-day mark and that's under 20, it's a really good sign. This is probably my favorite one. Accommodation and food services continuing to show improvements, which is great. Hopefully, the little not lockdowns, but the little sort of spikes, single cases we see sort of puts a little bit of nervousness into the community, can sometimes slow things down. We've seen it in, obviously Sydney, where a guy went to every barbecue store in Sydney, and then we've got one in sort of Melbourne and potentially Adelaide as well. But great to see accommodation and food services doing a lot better. And then the other one there, information media and telecommunications. Let's have a look at the most effective industries. Construction is a really, really important one. They performed so well through the pandemic. They were one of the leading industries through the pandemic, and what we've actually seen since January is almost three months of increases, and they're now up to 90 days overdue. To be honest, if you went back to pre-COVID days, I would say this is fairly standard for the construction industry. That's one definitely for people to keep an eye on and to see what is happening there. Admin and support services has really struggled through the pandemic, as people have brought a lot of those services in-house or done away with them altogether. Healthcare and social assistance, that funny one that we've spoken about a number of times. You ask, why is healthcare struggling in the middle of a global pandemic? Well, the fact is everything is focused on COVID, and you just have elective surgeries, for example, a really good example to use, either scrapped and put on hold totally. So if you're not operating in that COVID world, you're really affected with a lack of numbers, or just a much slower process to actually get through things like surgeries and appointments, etc. Transport, post and warehousing, not doing so well despite the e-commerce boom. Of course, people aren't traveling as much, and that's across train, planes and buses. For example, we've seen a big move to electronic invoicing, but also signatures as well. So you're doing away with documentation that's being couriered around the city, for example, little things like that, putting a lot of pressure on that industry. And then rental, hiring, real estate services, rounding out the top 5 there. So if you have a look at it across the board, what we've actually seen, and this is month on month, we've seen, I think it's 13 out of 19 industries have actually slowed their payments compared to March. Again, April is that funny month with a lot of people off due to public holidays and school holidays. So it's not dire. It's certainly not a dire view at the moment, but it is one that we will be keeping an eye on when we report on the May numbers in about a month's time, of course. Looking at year on year, this is great, where we get to now start to compare. April was really that first full month in 2020 that was affected by COVID, so we will start to see how does everything look. At the far left, obviously construction, admin, support. We've got all of these, so those first 3 services coming through that are really performing poorly compared to April of last year. But then we've got fairly good consistency towards the right, the middle to the right side of this graph. So this will be really important to watch through the year. I think important things to note about last year, we saw really good improvements in sort of May and June, as we came to terms with the fact that we were dealing with COVID. It was here to stay for a while, and our numbers, our health numbers started to reduce. But then, of course, June, July, we saw Victoria go into that extended lockdown, and payment times started to blow out again. So it'll be really interesting to start comparing those as we go through this year. Payment defaults, really important predictor of delinquency, of oncoming delinquency and failure. This is a CreditorWatch customer that's a creditor registering a default, or essentially a black mark, in a more colloquial term, against a debtor that owes them money, that is overdue. So March to April this year, we've seen a decrease of 20%, fairly standard from a seasonality perspective. Comparing April to April, a big decrease as well, 2020 to 2021. It seems that Australians, as I've said in the past, are very supportive of their country mates, or countrymen, I should say, and women, through things like fires and floods and of course the pandemic. So we haven't seen an increase in defaults. We haven't seen people coming back to register those, but definitely an important one to keep an eye on. The most recent slide that we've introduced is looking at the probability of default, and that's across the industry. So for those of you who do use CreditorWatch, you would know that we've got what we call our risk score. Within the risk score, it gives a probability of default. You get a credit rating, A through to sort of E or F, and then you get a probability of default. So the probability that particular company, or in this case the industry, will default in the next 12 months. And default is failure or not being able to meet their payment responsibilities. Accommodation and food services, despite the fact that they are performing really well, still up at that high end. transport, post and warehousing. So some familiar names that we've seen pop up through the pandemic. If you're looking sort of almost to that middle section, the shorter names there, retail, construction and mining, all very similar. I think anything that's closer to that sort of 4% and below is a very good position to be in. You know, you might say, well, 4% is not a lot. If you were a banker, you'd be saying something different. So there's different ways, of course, of looking at this. It's horses for courses. If you're providing small amounts of trade credit, obviously you can take on a lot more risk, where your risk appetite would be a lot larger. Whereas if you're providing unsecured loans, you know, you're going to be wanting the probability of default to be much closer to probably between 1% and 2%. Court actions, as I spoke about earlier, still well down, essentially waiting on you know, the ATO being the biggest, one of the biggest plaintiffs to start pursuing companies again for overdue tax debts, and that will happen, no doubt, in the next couple of months. And then the important one that, you know, that's been reported on so much is external administrations. This is one that just continues to sort of boggle the minds of I think most people out there. Very, very up and down through the pandemic. We know that they were, you know, sort of 40 to 50% down on pre-COVID numbers. So if you're comparing 2020 to 2019, what we've seen in 2021 is obviously an increase in Feb, another increase in March, and then it's come back off in April, and it's even further down on April numbers from 2020, so down 20%. So question is, when will this start to increase? I still think when we look back over the, you know, over a 12-month period, when we get to, you know, this stage in probably 2022, we will see a sustained increase back up to pre-COVID numbers. Again, the ATO is a big plaintiff, a big creditor, responsible for plenty of wind-ups and administrations as well. So we have to wait for them to get into it. And that's it from me from a business risk review perspective. Are there any questions from you, Ali or Harley?
From me, I guess a couple of comments about news that's come out this morning. I was really interested to see that Standard & Poor's have, you know, whacked a negative outlook on Australia after the budget. And I'm assuming, Harley, that is because of increasing debt levels. Would that be your view of what's going on?
Look, I think that's undoubtedly, Ali, why they have done it. I think to put things in perspective, we need to recognise that markets don't give the same importance to credit rating announcements now as they used to, particularly given how they so spectacularly missed the global financial crisis. But you are going to necessarily, I think, have a situation where you can't have a big expansionary budget like we've had when we already have deficits and debt at record levels and not expect a reaction from credit agencies. But I don't think it's something that will especially bother Australian financial markets in terms of its impact on the bond market or the currency market. And I don't think it's something we need to be especially perturbed about. It was just something that was probably always going to happen.
I guess you're not worried that, you know, if our rating really does change, that it will increase the cost of our debt and could have a snowball effect on the economy.
Well, that could happen down the track, but I mean, one of the keys behind this expansionary budget is that you've got a government that can, you know, borrow at less than 1%, and that's realistically probably not going to change if you potentially, hypothetically, got a downgrade to your credit rating from one of the three prominent rating agencies that we have. and maybe 2023, 2024, yeah, I think the situation probably changes, but it probably changes for just about every country on the planet. I think in terms of 2021 and 2022, we've just got to do what we've got to do to rebuild economies, and I'm not in terms of what our Reserve Bank's doing and the continuing downward pressure on bond rates and interest rates. If you were to get a down rating, which I think is unlikely, I really don't think it would have a material impact on the government's cost of borrowing to fund the budget it's just brought down.
I know it's certainly been a very long time since we've had a downward rating, but one of the investment banks has come out this morning and said this budget means that interest rates could rise sooner than expected. Have you got a view on that?
Well, we've seen the odd comment about that from time to time over the last few months. This is not a comment that's only sprung up related to the budget that was brought down last night. But all we can really do is look at the reinforcement that we get from our central bank. I mean, they made it clear in their monetary policy statement last Tuesday. They made it clear in their quarterly statement last Friday that they're not going to raise interest rates before 2024, and they're implicitly saying that any concerns about a red-hot residential property market are going to need to be handled by authorities other than themselves. As I've publicly said, we don't know when interest rates will rise, because they always rise at a point in time different to what people forecast early on in a cycle. But I think it's to be respectfully frank, I think it's a long boated draw based on what the Reserve Bank is saying, that they will be raising interest rates anytime in the near term future, and that would completely contradict what the government's just done to try and expand the economy. So it would be completely contradictory to try and make this economy grow again and regenerate the levels of employment that we need.
And they're very considered in the statements as well, aren't they? They're not flippant statements. There's a lot of time, effort, thought, calculation that goes into them.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, Patrick. And I think one of the things that has come out of the necessity of dealing with this unprecedented situation we've had over the last 12, 15 months is that you have a central bank that has been incredibly frank in portraying what it thinks it needs to do. But even a year or two before the pandemic, you didn't get that kind of transparency from a central bank. So when they're saying now this is what we think we're going to do, then I think you follow them first and follow everyone else second. To be blunt, yeah.
Patrick, I was going to ask you if the planned border closures until next year could affect Australian businesses in any way in terms of the recovery.
Yeah, definitely. Look, it's certainly going to put pressure on, the obvious ones like tourism. The simple fact is there are certain tourist operators, hotels, towns, cities that are totally reliant on international tourism, and the domestic tourism just doesn't make up for that loss. Retail is always going to be hurt by that naturally. and of course hospitality to a certain extent. But there is a a huge demand for coffees and lunches and nice dinners at the moment, which is good, and hopefully that that continues. The other one, the big question mark will be on the effect on education. We know our universities are held in extremely high regard globally, but particularly out of Asia. There's a lot of pressure on them at the moment. There's been plenty of discussion around flying students in, putting them up in quarantine so that they can come in. I think that's a pretty tough one when you've got Australians trying to get home that can't get home. So there's a question mark over what that looks like, and the cynic in me suggests that I don't know if they would want to be doing that in the months leading up to an election. And I think the other thing is there's a huge amount of demand for workers, that are often provided by international students, migrant workers, just additional people coming into the workforce. Whether it's on the farms, whether it's in the cities, it doesn't really make a difference. Hospitality is a big one. There's a huge need for workers at the moment, and that naturally puts pressure on businesses as well.
It's certainly, if you think about this time last year, we're in a totally different position, so it'll be fascinating to see where we are this time next year, and hopefully the borders will be open. We might even be in a booming economic condition.
That's right.
Hopefully so. Yep.
Ali, did you have anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I think that's pretty much it for me. I could talk about this under concrete, really, but that's definitely the highlight. So I'm keen to go out there and do my interviews for the rest of the day and talk to people on the ground about what they think and how businesses and also individuals can take advantage of all the measures that were outlined in last night's budget. I wouldn't mind getting late too.
Well, look, of course, for everyone listening, thank you for joining us today. We do have some analysis online, so if you jump onto CreditorWatch.com.au, you can either go to the blog, or we've actually got them loaded up ready for you in terms of the data. This is one of my favorite ones to look at, of course, is all the data that we've just been through. So having a look at defaults, how that's moving around from a 12-month perspective, and you can start to jump into various industries as well, very interactive. Of course, we've got our federal budget analysis in there too. That's downloadable, so jump in and have a look at that. And there will be plenty more that we will be reporting on. So don't be shy to jump onto CreditorWatch.com.au for more information. To our two superstar presenters, moderator, chief economist, Ali, thank you so much for keeping us in check, asking the right questions and the tough ones as well. I reckon you went a little bit soft on Harley, to be honest. And of course, Harley, our chief economist, thank you for joining us as well, guys. It's great to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This interactive way of doing it is certainly a fun way of doing it. So thank you very much. And of course, thanks to everyone who joined us today. Appreciate that, it's a little bit longer, but there was plenty to get through. And as Ali said, we could have spoken about it all day, but we won't take you away from your day job. So thank you everyone for making the time, and we will see you at the next webinar, hopefully. Have a good day.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks all.